Hey, welcome to the Gentle Rebel podcast. I'm Andy Mort, and this is where, together, we explore the intersection of high sensitivity, creativity, and our relationship with the culture around us. I hope you're doing well. I hadn't heard of the author James Allen until I started researching the history of self-help for a bit of a project that I'm inadvertently working on at the moment. I've been exploring some of the core characteristics, common principles, and the way that it kind of functions in modern society. And this book, As a Man Thinketh, came up as a foundational text from the beginning of the 20th century. It was published in 1903. And I was kind of curious about this. I was like, that's quite old. And James Allen's name sounds like a contemporary self-help author. I was like, oh, yeah, James Allen. Sounds like, I think I'm pretty sure I follow him on Instagram. Turns out, no, he died in, 1912? But yeah, I was curious about this. So I had a read and felt kind of perplexed and confused by the book, especially in reading it as a self-help book, which by all accounts was James Allen's intention back when he wrote it, insofar as he described the book as dealing with the power of thought and how thought can be applied to character, conditions, and personal happiness. And so he talked about setting out to write a simple pocketbook with teaching that all can easily grasp and follow, putting into practice the methods which it advises. And he said, it shows how in their own thought world, each human holds the key to every condition, good or bad, that enters into our life, and that by working patiently and intelligently upon our thoughts, we may remake our life and transform our circumstances. And he called it a book that will help you to help yourself. So it is a self-help book. And yeah, we're using the phrase, it's the thought that counts, as our theme in the Haven this month. And so the zine on this particular topic is coming together right now. I'm kind of in between working on it at the moment. And it'll be released in a couple of weeks, hopefully, if all goes to plan. But yeah, as such, I wanted to look at some of the influential self-help books that specifically focus on this idea of thought and the power of the mind and thoughts creating reality, which is a common idea that we see come up in the genre quite a lot. And it has obviously from, I think, actually doing some digging before James Allen. Obviously, the New Thought movement in the States was kind of unraveling or becoming what it became during the 19th century, so through the 1800s. And so, As a Man Thinketh, this book by James Allen seems like a good place to anchor into some of these ideas as well, which is what we're doing in this episode. So who was James Allen? There's not actually a huge amount of biographical information about Allen. What we do know is he was born in Leicester, which is just up the road from me here in England. And he was born in 1864. His father tragically died 2 days after arriving in New York, where he was looking for work. And that meant that James, at the age of 15, had to leave school and earn a living in order to support his family. He did various things, became a writer, published his first book, From Poverty to Power, in 1901. And then kept writing until his death, as I say, in 1912, when he was just 47. So, yeah, I've read 3 of his books over the past few weeks to kind of get a sense of the trajectory of his writing career, I suppose, or his book publishing career. So From Poverty to Power, which was his first one, As a Man Thinketh, the one that I'm going to talk about in this episode, which was his most influential, and then The Divine Companion, which was his final book that was published posthumously by his wife, Lily Allen, not that one. I wanted to get a sense of that journey that he'd been on. It would be fascinating to see how that would have continued if he lived longer, because he crammed a lot into a rather prolific 11 years of writing. But I guess I'm interested in exploring the implications of the ideas that are contained within As a Man Thinketh, because its influence has endured over the past 120 odd years. And I think it can take us in both insightful, liberating, and also dark directions, depending on how we interpret, how we perceive, how we read what it is that this book contains. And I think it's a good opportunity to do a bit of critical thinking in relation to self-help in general as well, because it does kind of speak to some very familiar ideas. It brings some familiar tropes from the genre or into our view as we're reading it. So, yeah, do we take it literally as a kind of universal treatise on the way reality works, on the way that things are, on human nature and that kind of thing? Or do we see it as something not to take literally, not to take too seriously in many ways, but to experience in a more creative, poetic way? So to take things, play with them, see how particular ideas help or not, and to take or leave things in that kind of way. Because it's not obviously a scientific treatise, it's not a philosophical treatise. It's more just a reflection of things that occurred to James Allen and ideas that he thought were interesting. But I'm not sure I'm not sure how, like, his relationship with these ideas. I think he takes it more seriously than we ought to, really. I think that I'll say that at the outset. But yeah, he sort of builds on, or finds metaphors, finds ideas, and really flies with them as if they are truth, rather than helpful ways to probe and point and prod at ideas that might be interesting to explore, which I think is really at the heart of the merit of this book, as far as I can see. And I think it takes us in very tricky directions if we take it literally and if we believe what it is that he's saying. So let's begin with the title, As a Man Thinketh. Quite hard to say, As a Man Thinketh. Allen loosely anchors this book to Proverbs in the Bible. So Proverbs 23:7 is where that line comes from in the King James version of the Bible. As a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. And he lifts this line completely out of context. I imagine he thought about it in isolation and sort of ran with that as a compelling idea. It's the sort of thing I do. You hear a little snippet of a line and you're like, oh, yeah, I wonder how I could kind of think about that and play with that as an idea. But in the original proverb, this message is largely, I guess you could interpret it as a warning to be wary of other people's hidden thoughts. So as a man thinketh, so is he. So it's within these thoughts, that's where you see somebody's character, intentions and motives that are hidden maybe from view, especially within this proverb is a warning about those with wealth and influence and an appetite for power, and to be careful around those people, or to think twice. When you sit down to eat with a ruler, it says, consider carefully what is before you. Do not crave his delicacies, for they are a deceptive food. And so we might read this proverb as a call for discernment in the face of power, and a warning against the games and the tastes and the debts that these people might embroil you in, might draw you into kind of suffering at the hands of. But this is not how Allen uses the words from this proverb. He kind of runs with the idea that they've conjured in him, which is a call to prosperity, through thought. So the idea that you create who you are through the way that you think. And so he lifts half of a verse. Like, this is not even a single line. It's half of a verse that implies that, or he implies, we use it in the way that he uses half of that verse, that you can think your way to the life that you want. And this is obviously why the book has become a key text in kind of things like The Secret, manifestation, law of attraction, that kind of stuff. And so his use of biblical language in itself is perhaps, I mean, certainly less about delivering a theological commentary. You know, this is not about God or anything like that. It's more of a move towards, I would say, familiar authority. And so using the credibility of the way that the biblical language is structured and it sounds to essentially give credence to the ideas that he's presenting through that medium. You know, this was a time when the King James translation of the Bible was used as, you know, with a rhetorical sense of purpose. And we might, you know, compare this to the way that we hear phrases like backed by science used today to kind of give weight, give credence, give credibility to concepts that people come up with in self-help. And so it's like, yeah, you sort of frame it with these things that are, I guess, that reassure the reader that they can trust what it is that they're reading or listening to, with a culturally valuable reference point. You know, this thing that we recognize as, oh yeah, that I take that seriously. It's backed by science, or it has this biblical sounding language that has a moral authority, a moral weight to it. So it sounds more serious than it actually is. So chapter 1, thought and character. We're going to kind of go through the chapters. I originally wrote 13,000 words about this book, and I've managed to whittle it down to 6,000. So I was thinking I'm going to have to do some kind of mini series about this. I was like, I can't spend my time doing that. So yeah, hopefully we're just going to get it all done in this single episode. But yeah, we'll go through the chapters one by one and kind of see how Alan's argument builds through that and the directions he takes as he goes. So it begins with the aphorism, as a man thinketh in his heart, so is he, not only embraces the whole of a man's being, but is so comprehensive as to reach out to every condition and circumstance of his life. A man is literally what he thinks, his character being the complete sum of all his thoughts. Just before we get into that quote, sort of picking apart, I just want to say, like, while the archaic language here carries strong sort of patriarchal weight, you know, we're talking about man and he, everything is framed in that way. We're going to take the use of the word man, not as an implication of sex, but as a reference to people, to all humans. I will try to change it. Certainly when it makes sense, I'll say to people, or to use one rather than man. But it's not always easy, especially when I'm reading quotes, to remember to do that. So take that in good faith. But yeah, a couple of things struck me about this opening line. It's interesting that he calls it an aphorism. So an aphorism, a line like this becomes an aphorism when its context is removed. So an aphorism is like a succinct observation that contains a general truth, or like an idiom, or a little saying that, you know, just stands on its own. As a man thinketh, so is he. That's an aphorism. But as we saw, kind of thinking about, you know, the title of this, the general truth that Alan believes is contained in what he describes as an aphorism here isn't actually the truth that is contained in the proverb that holds the line itself. And so we can see the aphorism that he is referring to is his own, I suppose, but he's presenting it as if it's a generally accepted way of understanding this line, if that makes sense. And the other thing that struck me here is the use of the word literally. A man is literally what he thinks. You know, what is James Allen saying here? He's kind of suggesting a clear distinction, certainly between mind, body, you know, soul or spirit, whatever. You know, mind is the number one. It rules the body. We are not influenced or shaped in any meaningful way by biological imperatives, for example, or unconscious processes, the things of the mind that we don't think, or physiological makeup, these kinds of things, or by experiences, by cultures, by contexts, by the social climate that we are within. We are literally what we think. And that strikes me as quite a big claim. And speaking of context, I think it's worth spending a moment just on the concept of fate, fortune, destiny, these kinds of ideas that you sort of hear these words in early philosophy. A lot of early philosophers, religious leaders would speak of the uncontrollable forces of nature in this way, the will of the gods, as it might be portrayed, in a chain of cause and effect that can't be meddled with or affected by humans. Storms, death, illness, those kinds of things. And I suppose this changes to some degree with modernity, the availability of kind of more accessible, improved healthcare, for example, nutrition, kind of education, living conditions, all of these things, as well as, better technological preparations for and responses to natural disasters, and a move towards secularism as well, meant that we did start to change the course of events a little bit more as humans and prevent the inevitability of those previously conceived fates. But there were new forces over which people had an increasingly lack of control, and they started to employ stoic acceptance of a new kind of fate, which became more powerful through a post-industrial spread of capitalism, increasing individualism, and all of that sort of stuff. What philosopher Mark Fisher coined capitalist realism, famously quoting Frederick Jameson and Slavoj Žižek, it's easier to imagine an end to the world than an end to capitalism, which is to say, succumbing to capitalism's pervasive atmosphere that acts as an invisible barrier which confines our ability to imagine, to think, to act our way towards alternative possibilities and horizons beyond the capitalist structure, the capitalist ideology. So fate, in this sense, is capitalism's inevitability, and all that comes with being a subject under its sort of shape-shifting demands to extract, to categorize, to marketize, to consume in the name of survival and growth. And so this is, in a sense, a new fate that feels as real as the gods believed to be the force behind the fate of ancient times. An ideology is the story that we carry without thinking. We don't think about that story because it doesn't feel like a story. And this legitimizes power relations by seeing how things are as how things have to be, because they are natural, or so we think. And we witness the rise of self-help in part as a genre of books that has a really important function within this structure, within this system, in reinforcing capitalism's sense of inevitability, but not in a hard power way. It's not saying, this is your fate, you have to deal with it, but rather in a positive and aspirational way. The warm, fuzzy feeling that promises hope. Things might feel bad right now for you in your life, but they don't have to stay like that. There is future light, and here is how you can take control as an individual, how you can make change, how you can live a better tomorrow. But you have to take responsibility for bettering your life. You have the power to make things change. And with this, our instincts for kind of wider societal change or structural change or social justice, equality, those kinds of things get gradually replaced with a doctrine of self-help, i.e. the world will change if everybody takes responsibility for changing their own little part of it, changing themselves. And yet this doesn't seem to hold water at a greater scale. Because just like capitalism itself, there's a shape-shifting quality that keeps us chasing the mirage of change, keeps us pursuing things that we can never quite reach, promises relief, promises satisfaction, but those things are always just deliberately out of reach, like a pool of liquid gold on the horizon. And so with this, James Allen might be seen as an angel of this ideology, as our perception of fate shifts to the individual. We're taught to believe that control, power, and freedom belong within. The only thing stopping us from accessing happiness and joy and wealth and satisfaction is us. So self-help, like we see in As a Man Thinketh, becomes an instructional manual for that better future, for that change that we are responsible for inviting into our own lives and creating for ourselves. In his first book, From Poverty to Power, James Allen writes, "Meditation is the intense dwelling in thought upon an idea or theme, with the object of thoroughly comprehending it. And whatsoever you constantly meditate upon, you will not only come to understand, but will grow more and more into its likeness. For it will become incorporated into your very being, will become, in fact, your very self. If, therefore, you constantly dwell upon that which is selfish and debasing, you will ultimately become selfish and debased. If you ceaselessly think upon that which is pure and unselfish, you will surely become pure and unselfish." And so this, I think, kind of sets up the path for As a Man Thinketh, and what seems to move from maybe more of a reflective set of observations about how things are, which From Poverty to Power seems to be the kind of general vibe of that book. And that's embodied, I think, in this passage where we see a kind of self-evident truth that a person's life tends to reflect the things that they invest their thoughts in. And like we learn through kind of confirmation bias, we see more of what we believe to be true already, and we seek information that reinforces existing judgments that we have about the world. And this has an impact on our perception of reality and the way that we think about things, which then has a spiraling effect. The things that we think about a lot are more likely to be the things that kind of happen in our lives. But Alan goes a lot further than this, especially in this book, As a Man Thinketh, where he sort of turns this into a prescription for success. He writes, "As a being of power, intelligence, and love, and the lord of his own thoughts, man holds the key to every situation and contains within himself that transforming and regenerative agency by which he may make himself what he wills. And act is the blossom of thought, and joy and suffering are its fruits. Thus does a man garner in the sweet and bitter fruitage of his own husbandry." What does that mean? That's like a lot of gobbledygook. But perhaps it means whatever we will ourselves to be, we become. And if we add a can in there, whatever we will ourselves to be, we can become. Our actions are the blossom of our thoughts. The joy or suffering that we encounter is a direct outcome of our thinking. So therefore, if we change our thinking, we will experience joy or suffering, depending on what that thinking is like. And, by virtue of that line of thought, our suffering or our joy is, we have ourselves to blame for it. Of course, if we read this in a less prescriptive self-help way, it simply describes the fact that our thoughts influence the actions that we might choose to take, and those actions that might contribute to or hinder the path that we are trying to navigate. For example, if I swim in a sea of bitter and envious thoughts and I'm constantly looking for ways to outdo people, and I'm seeing everything through a very competitive, zero-sum lens, then people might not like hanging out with me very much, and then they might stop inviting me to brunch, and I might not get opportunities that I would potentially get if I was to think more favorably about others, if I was to celebrate their successes and support them. There's a bit of a, I guess, practical definition of karma in this. You tend to reap what you sow through your life eventually. That's what maybe this is. This could be read as if we were not reading it as a self-help book. And so it's not a formula for success, especially if you think fondly of others only because you've been told that it's going to bring prosperity. That's why this can't work as a universalizing prescription. It's just kind of a general observation about how things tend to work out, the general trends, the general patterns that we might observe when we look at the world around us. But there is a dark implication to this idea when we follow its logic through. Joy and suffering are the fruits of our thoughts, and whether those fruits are sweet or bitter is our responsibility. A person is made or unmade by themselves. In the armory of thought, one forges the weapons by which one destroys themselves. That's quite a claim. So an individual is to blame for what happens to them. They attract it with their thinking. Yeah. Whether or not that's what he intended, that's how these words can be read. Chapter 2, the effect of thought on circumstance. A man's mind may be likened to a garden, which may be intelligently cultivated or allowed to run wild, but whether cultivated or neglected, it must and will bring forth. So it's interesting how he associates a mind being allowed to run wild with a neglected mind. You know, I quite like letting my mind garden run wild at times. It's quite freeing, and it's a source of creative exploration and intelligence, I would say. But yeah, here we begin to see Alan draw a parallel between inner thoughts and outer circumstances. You know, every flower or weed in the external world of our circumstances grows directly from what we have planted internally through our thoughts. It's essentially this metaphor. And I think it's worth thinking about the function of metaphor here as well. This is something that I've noticed in personal development literature and self-help a lot, where we can get swept up in poetic language to the extent where we confuse the image, the metaphor, for the truth that it's attempting to kind of point us towards or reveal beneath it. Of course, the mind is not a garden. It's not actually a garden. It cannot be intelligently cultivated or allowed to run wild in the way that a garden might be. This isn't to say that this can't be a helpful image to use when thinking about the way that the mind does tend to work. Of course, thoughts can act like seeds that take root and flourish in desirable actions and all that kind of stuff. And there are ways that we can treat our thought seeds like gardeners, you know, watering them, tending to them, protecting them from external forces, allowing them to grow in ways that we might want them to. But that is a metaphor. Interestingly, I think he treats the idea of this mind garden as existing outside of a social context as well. So it doesn't even do a great job with this metaphor, as far as I'm concerned. It sort of falls short because it fails to acknowledge the impact of the weather, of weeds that might get sort of blown in, you know, dandelion things that are constantly sort of landing in your own garden and taking root there. People sabotaging the soil because maybe they're like, oh, I'm jealous of your garden. I don't want your garden to be successful. Parasites, funguses, fungi, birds, slugs, climate change, you know, not to mention the gardener's own capacity to keep on top of it all, their physical ability to be able to do that. So yeah, these things that could represent what we face in reality, in real life, stuff that genuinely impacts who we are, how we are in the landscape of our circumstances. These aren't really sort of there in this metaphor. So yes, this is to say, hold metaphors lightly, you know, and they are not the thing that they are talking about. And yeah, this particular one, take it further than Alan does, and we might reach some truths actually that he denied, and some things that I don't think he intended. So it could be more helpful than he is realizing in terms of undermining some of the arguments that he makes. Every man is where he is by the law of his being. The thoughts which he has built into his character have brought him there, and in the arrangement of his life there is no element of chance. No element of chance. Everything can be traced back to our thoughts. And he goes on, suffering is always the effect of wrong thought in some direction. It is an indication that the individual is out of harmony with himself. Again, always is an interesting word here. Always the effect of wrong thought in some direction. Again, indicating Alan's garden is immune from the impact of outside forces. This is all about your inner world. This is all about the thoughts that you have. And so we might kind of interpret his use of the word suffering here as talking about an individual's judgment or assessment of their circumstances. You know, the source of suffering is how you think about it. And the implication being, if you put a positive spin on it, you no longer suffer. So suffering is just your own way of thinking. But this doesn't seem particularly insightful or profound or true. It ignores the other ways that we understand suffering, what we know suffering to be, which is to undergo pain, distress, or hardship. Yeah, and I think Alan's take here is the core of toxic positivity, which essentially denies reality. It tells you that if you're suffering, that's only because you're thinking about things in the wrong way. Yeah, that's just objectively not true when suffering occurs at the hands of another person, as a group within a system, or in the face of oppression, injustice, an invading army. Suffering is not always the effect of wrong thought in some direction. To pin suffering to a mindset in this way is ridiculous, and to take it literally and say that people who suffer do so because they willed it with the direction of their thought is a recipe to open the door and give a free pass to all manner of violence and harm, while at the same time blaming the victims for thinking their own way into that. On a slightly more trivial note, the England cricket captain Ben Stokes said while suffering with injuries in the fourth of 5 test matches against India this summer, 2025, that pain is just an emotion.
Yeah, another obviously big week last week at Lords, with time spent out in the middle with, bat in the hand and obviously overs bowled, and then same again this week. So, yeah, said it a few times to the guys out there. Pain is just an emotion. So, just one of those things.
Now I completely get what he was saying as he was, coping his way through the match that he got injured in. He was able in that situation to sort of temporarily override his suffering with painkillers, I suppose, and a mental frame that kind of helped him push through it. But beyond this context, pain is objectively not just an emotion. It's the body's rather incredible way of communicating that something is wrong and that you need to address it in some way.
Don't want to eat my words, but the likelihood that I won't play is very unlikely.
And interestingly, he was unable to play the next match, the fifth and final test match, because he was injured. How much he allowed his pain to impact him was a choice to a certain degree in that previous match, but only temporarily, and certainly not for long if he kept doing what was causing the injury, if he kept putting stress and strain on that thing that was being highlighted by his pain as a source of suffering. So applying this to James Allen's assertion that suffering is always the effect of wrong thought in some direction, we might find an unintentional truth. Indeed, Ben Stokes might invite suffering because of the way he is thinking about pain. This is not to say that suffering is simply the result of believing that we are suffering. It is saying that suffering comes from thinking that we are not in pain. Or that we shouldn't be in pain, telling us a story about the pain is weakness or whatever it might be. And in this sense, we suffer when we try to pretend that we are not suffering. But that's not what Alan was saying. Alan writes that circumstance does not make the man, it reveals him to himself. So this again might be read in 2 ways. It could mean that we build character and self-awareness through adversity. In the Ben Stokes example, what he is indicating through the words pain is just an emotion is that he is under strain in that situation, and he is seeing how far he is willing to push his body in pursuit of an outcome. The circumstance reveals something to us about ourselves, about what we are willing to sacrifice in pursuit of whatever it is that we are sacrificing for, and how stupid, how brave, how risky we are willing to be in pursuit of that outcome. And this can be read as a neutral statement, akin to the idea that, our true colours are revealed when we are under the pump, under strain. This might surprise us. It might surprise us how we respond to certain things. We might anticipate responding in a particular way to the circumstances we imagine being in, only to find that when we're actually in those circumstances, we respond in a totally different way. But we can also work on changing that response in future as we as self-reflective creatures, human beings are able to, kind of reshape certain patterns of behavior. But over time, that takes time, and it is not done with a simple linguistic mindset shift. And so read another way, the notion that circumstance reveals us to ourselves can imply that poverty, failure, or illness reveal how defective our thinking is, and that with suffering as always the effect of wrong thought in some direction, we deserve the circumstances we find ourselves in because we haven't worked intelligently enough on our thoughts. And so to the outside world as well, it's obvious through the adversity that we are facing or the situation that we are in that, well, it's your own fault. You've willed your suffering through weak-mindedness. Chapter 3, the effect of thought on health and body. Disease and health, like circumstances, are rooted in thought. Sickly thoughts will express themselves through a sickly body. Okay, here we go again. What is he saying here? Dare we even open this chapter and look at what it has within it? As with many of Alan's claims, one direction of interpretation kind of makes sense, but taken the other way, it takes us on a very dark path. For example, it tracks that those who get caught up in resentment, bitterness, cynicism may struggle to co-regulate and sustain good social bonds with other people if they're constantly looking at them through those eyes. And social bonds, social connection are vital for a person's well-being. That's kind of obvious. Alan seems to be saying that sickness and health are a reflection of the state of a person's mind. They are the product of the mind. And I can't help but think of how this links to sort of purity thinking and the dangerous ways that this can play out through modern wellness trends and the way that we've seen it play out in recent years. It can catalyze a sort of pathological drive towards detoxification and cleansing, for example, which I was thinking about after watching Apple Cider Vinegar on Netflix. The story of Belle Gibson, that social media influencer who made up that she had cancer. And this story sort of highlights other people as well, like fictional characters, I think based loosely on real life characters who follow some of the offshoots of purity mindset wellness thinking. And I was kind of struck by the echoes, the religious echoes here, where spiritual purification and sanctification from having your sins washed clean, it comes through these cleanses, enemas, visceral repulsion at the presence of natural biological and physiological processes, things like bacteria, like this visceral hatred of these things that actually are part of our kind of makeup and the natural symbiotic stuff that goes on as a way to help us survive as people, as beings, as organisms. And so there becomes this association of disease being the responsibility of the person suffering from it. And, it's a reflection of an unclean life, an unclean body, all of these things that are wrapped up in this imagery. And it almost directly reflects what James Allen writes in this chapter. Out of a clean heart comes a clean life and a clean body. Out of a defiled mind proceeds a defiled life and a corrupt body. Thought is the foundation of action, life, and manifestation. Make the fountain pure, and all will be pure. Yeah. Chapter 4, Thought and Purpose. He who has conquered doubt and fear has conquered failure. Another big, bold statement there. Very simplistic. So this is about another familiar concept that we often read about in self-help, which is the importance of finding purpose as a way to conquer doubt and fear and failure. And I think one way of reading that quote is to see failure as a judgment about the outcome rather than the outcome itself. And so this resonates with the precept that there is no failure, there is only learning. Life setbacks, disappointments, and regrets don't mark the ultimate end of the story. You can always take something from it that you can learn for next time. And if we think of failure as this sense of finality, we stop moving. That failure is the point at which we stop moving. But if we carry forward what we've learned, then even mistakes and missteps can become part of a wider trajectory towards better things. And in this light, fear and doubt become obstacles when they prevent us from moving forward. They lead to stagnation. And so by cultivating the safety to fail, that is the confidence to be able to take risks, knowing that, even if this doesn't go to plan, even if this doesn't work out, I will still be fundamentally okay in my sense of being. And then we can loosen the grip of that fear of failure, that doubt in ourselves. And in this sense, we really can conquer the paralyzing threat of failure. But it's the threat of failure that we are sort of, lessening the impact of, rather than eradicating failure from our lives. That's one interpretation. Again, I don't think it's what Alan intended. And it doesn't fit with the idea that he is, teaching methods and practices for readers to follow. And in that light, I think we're more likely reading advice about success, depending on eradicating fear and doubt altogether. So how do we do this? Conceiving of our central purpose. This is what he offers as the solution, as the advice here. And if we can identify that purpose, find our purpose, discover our calling, whatever it might be sort of framed as, our why, we are able to eradicate worries and fears and troubles and self-pityings, all of which are indications of weakness, and lead just as surely as deliberately planned sins, though by a different route, to failure, unhappiness, and loss. For weakness cannot persist in a power-evolving universe. So the advice is simple. Not necessarily easy to understand what on earth he's talking about there. It's to set a goal, have a direction, mark out a straight pathway to its achievement, looking neither to the right nor to the left. And so this, again, has sort of biblical undertones, maybe overtones, echoing words in the Gospel of Matthew. Wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. Sounds like it kind of makes sense, but what does it mean? Where is Alan's straight pathway taking us? And why? What does it mean to achieve it? All of this stuff it's that sort of the writing that you're kind of reading and nodding along to. Yeah, that's great. I need to find the path that leads to my achievement. I need to do that so I eradicate worry and doubt and fear. And, I've found myself like this with a lot of personal development and self-help language over the years. You're kind of nodding along because it sounds right. There's like an intuitive sense of connection to the way that the words like land, but you read it again, it's like, what's that actually mean? It doesn't mean anything. It's just fluff. It's just words. So chapter 5, the thought factor in achievement. Before a man can achieve anything, even in worldly things, he must lift his thoughts above slavish animal indulgence. Is that true? Sounds like a good idea, but I'm not sure it's true. I mean, I've seen people achieve all sorts of things despite and perhaps due to rather slavish animal indulgence. So what does achievement mean to Alan? I think this is one of the biggest gaps in the book, probably the biggest gap in the book. Like, what does he mean? How is he defining success? How is he defining failure? These are really sort of slippery words. And perhaps it's a deliberate omission which allows it to be interpreted and applied in a kind of infinite number of ways. So it's this thing that sounds like it's being profound. It sounds like it has substance and weight beneath it, but actually it can just be used by whoever, however they want to use it. And ultimately it doesn't actually mean anything. And the insinuation here is once again sort of drawing on a Victorian morality, where to be caught in pleasure or idleness is to be enslaved, and to dream, to sacrifice, that's where you find freedom. And this is, again, probably a riff on familiar ideas in religious texts that distinguish between flesh and spirit, the body being this sort of defiling force. And again, like we saw in chapter 3, there's a division between thought and instinct, between the mind and the body. It's almost like the mind is this source of purity, and the body is this thing that tries to drag the mind down into this debasing animal indulgence. And while Alan doesn't describe what this means in practice, it's kind of derivative enough of biblical and old spiritual texts as to give quite an evocative familiarity along this moral framework that would make sense to a late Victorian audience who's reading this. And we also see here another subtle but somewhat significant move that provides advice and guidance. He who would accomplish little must sacrifice little, and he who would achieve much must sacrifice much. So sacrifice leads to success. But again, what does this mean in the context of good thought being the source of happiness and success? Is it actually that accomplishing external results is the aim after all? Is that what he's saying? In what sense are you talking about accomplishing and achieving? And I think this takes us possibly more squarely into the realm of material striving as the definition of a person's purpose. These are the things you want to be looking to accomplish and achieve in the external realm as a way to symbolize your worthiness and your purity and your value as a human being. Rather than it being a kind of more spiritual and intrinsic internal endeavor, a virtuous person is the one who sacrifices in pursuit of accomplishment and does so without complaining. Once again, I think we can see how self-help is utilized or can be utilized as an ideological tool for the Protestant work ethic, encouraging workers to strive for more, however much it might cost them personally. Sacrifice is this point of virtue. And it's this sleight of hand, I think, that we see in modern day hustle culture. You can sort of see a relation here, a parallel, that which Byung-Chul Han describes in the Burnout Society, which we're encouraged to sacrifice ourselves to the system. And this system is sustained by this ideology of promise, the mirage waiting just ahead, the land of milk and honey, of peace, of wholeness, of rest. Keep striving, keep putting yourself into this constant treadmill of work in order to get to where it is that you'll never get. And this is reinforced by the passage: the universe does not favour the greedy, the dishonest, the vicious, although on the mere surface it may sometimes appear to do so. It helps the honest, the magnanimous, the virtuous. All the great teachers of the ages have declared this in varying forms, and to prove and know it, a man has but to persist in making himself more and more virtuous by lifting up his thoughts. When I first read that, it felt like, okay, this is a slightly different, fresher insight. Alan is putting some meat on the bones of what he construes as good and bad thinking. And this is actually a sort of internal thing rather than, using thinking to become successful in the eyes of the world. The great law of the universe, as he describes it, while it may appear to reward the greedy, the dishonest, the vicious with material wealth, doesn't really do this. They may appear to get the things that they dream of, but maybe their rewards are empty. Perhaps they're short-lived. Or perhaps, it's the insight that with all of these material rewards and this material success actually comes with a fear of losing them, a dissatisfaction that fuels a perpetual insatiable desire for more. Actually, I don't quite have enough because I don't have as much as that person over there, or they're trying to steal it from me, and all of these things that actually make you lead a very unsettled and dissatisfied life. If they were truly successful, why would billionaires be constantly striving in a spirit of dissatisfaction for more of everything that they already have in abundance? But in what way does the universe help the honest, the magnanimous, the virtuous? What is James Allen actually saying here? Even as all the great teachers of the ages have stated this, what does it actually mean to make oneself more virtuous by lifting up your thoughts? And does this not, in fact, risk us pacifying ourselves and sacrificing our power to the powers that be? I've known many good people get hit by a seemingly relentless flow of bad luck, and people with bad intentions and selfish ambitions seemingly get everything that they could dream of. This great law doesn't seem to play out in reality, but the idea that it should can keep good people tethered to the ideology of promise in a system that profits from them believing that good times are just around the corner. Chapter 6, Visions and Ideals. Dream lofty dreams, and as you dream, so shall you become. Another beautiful little aphorism. This is one of, I think, Alan's probably most quotable lines. It feels really familiar. It sounds like it's, fresh out of a 21st century meme. But yeah, we are arriving here at the reason Alan has been linked to the law of attraction, I think, as well. It's obviously been threaded throughout, but this is insinuation being that if you dream it, it can come true. He comes to some new metaphors as well, to imagine the dream laying dormant, like this dream being almost this platonic ideal, this thing that exists beyond the realm of where we are, beyond the physical. It's waiting to be activated. It's ready to come to life in a person. The oak sleeps in the acorn. The bird waits in the egg. These images carry a biological inevitability. The dream is the potential, sitting, waiting, sleeping, and it must unfold into reality. The metaphor becomes almost evidence here of the presence of that dream. And like the oak tree in the properly seeded acorn, or the bird in a well-incubated egg, the dream will emerge and the vision will inevitably manifest in the person who wants it to, the person who nurtures it. It's, again, a nice image, but it's no more than that. It's not true. We are not literally born harbouring a dream in that way. However nice that idea sounds, and however true that appears when used to describe how certain things came to life, when you're looking retrospectively at something that you're describing, I can see where that started. I can see the sort of process of how that came to life. That didn't mean that was always there. That's just how life unfolds. And Alan returns here as well to this idea of sacrifice. He tells the story of a youth who is pressed by poverty and labour, confined to long hours in an unhealthy workshop. And so readers might see ourselves reflected in the life of this young man that he depicts, working hard, not earning what we wish we could. He dreams of better things, he says. He thinks of intelligence, of refinement, of grace and beauty. He conceives of and mentally builds up an ideal condition of life. The vision of the wider liberty and a larger scope takes possession of him. Unrest urges him to action, and he utilises all his spare time and means, small though they are, to the development of his latent powers and resources. And so Alan kind of he shows how this youth strives to a point of mastery, wielding worldwide influence and almost unequalled power. In his hands he holds the cords of gigantic responsibilities. He speaks, and lo, lives are changed. Men and women hang upon his words and remould their characters, and sun-like he becomes the fixed and luminous centre around which innumerable destinies revolve. He has realised the vision of his youth. He has become one with his ideal. We're not told who this youth is, but part of me wonders whether Alan sees himself in this a little bit. There's a bit of grandioseness to the way that he presents this unfolding vision. And he encourages us, the youthful reader, that's very nice of him, to realise the vision, not the idle wish of your heart, be it base or beautiful or a mixture of both. For you will always gravitate towards that which you secretly most love. Into your hands will be placed the exact results of your own thoughts. You will receive that which you earn, no more, no less. And so, yes, I don't know what that makes the secret most lovingness of the youth's heart. Was he obsessed with the idea of people gathering around him like the sun, being a luminous centre around which innumerable destinies revolve? It's pretty, I don't know, it feels quite narcissistic in many ways. But yeah, this is the story at the start of many self-help books. I think the author's origin story, intended to sort of aspirationally attract the reader into believing that a different life is possible, by kind of showing off the story that they've lived, or the story that they are telling us that they've lived. If they can do it, so can I. If I just work harder, employ the right strategies, think the right thoughts, dream the right dreams, that's what the author did. And look where they are now. They deserve what they have because the success is proof of the purity of their dream, the virtue that they have. Success is the outward expression of pure inward thinking and the diligent, intelligent action that follows. And so Alan paints here a picture of every individual receiving exactly what they deserve based on the state of their heart. He says the thoughtless, the ignorant and the indolent, seeing only the apparent effects of things and not the things themselves, talk of luck, of fortune and chance. See a man grow rich, they say, how lucky he is. Observing another become intellectual, they exclaim, how highly favoured he is. And noting the saintly character and wide influence of another, they remark, how chance aids him at every turn. They do not see the trials and failures and struggles which these men have voluntarily encountered in order to gain their experience. They have no knowledge of the sacrifices they have made, of the undaunted efforts they have put forth, of the faith they have exercised, that they might overcome the apparently insurmountable and realize the vision of their heart. They do not know the darkness and the heartaches. They only see the light and joy and call it luck. Do not see the long and arduous journey, but only behold the pleasant goal and call it good fortune. Do not understand the process, but only perceive the result and call it chance. And so, the icing on the cake is here. You can't put the person's success down to anything other than hard work. There's nothing lucky about it. They've worked hard and earned everything that they have from a level playing field, this perfectly meritocratic vision of reality. And I think what we have here is walls being built around people that stops any sense of accountability being had. And this, again, is a thing that you just sort of see a lot in the world where people are protected behind this story that they deserve everything that they have, that they've earned it fairly, that they've been honest, and that their success, their reputation, all of this stuff is a result of pure thinking and good dreams. And the flip side of that is anybody that's like, hold on a second, this doesn't quite feel right, is envious. And then chapter 7, the final chapter, Serenity. Self-control is strength, right thought is mastery, calmness is power. This is how James Allen closes the book. Kind of introduces a slightly more poetic tone, I think here. It sort of invokes art and imagination and beauty as the forces that shape life in some ways. He gestures towards the composers, the sculptors, the prophets, the sages who make the world beautiful and whose visions sustain humanity. And at moments it feels slightly more free and expansive. It's like an acknowledgement that meaning is forged within imagination and creativity, which is enough on its own. And this is refreshing. We finally get a sense of what he deems to be an attractive and desirable way to live, the things to care about, the things to invest ourselves in. And there's a return to shades of stoicism beneath this calmness, this self-awareness, this equanimity in the face of an uncertain world that isn't controlled or controllable by the mind. He describes the serene person as a sheltering rock, a shade-giving tree, someone whose poise commands respect and trust. And these are really genuinely attractive images of people that we can find safety in, find confidence in, be able to trust, sources of steadiness, of calm, of reliability. And on the one hand, it could be describing a successful person as someone who provides that source of calm for others, that sheltering rock, that shade-giving tree. However, there is, once again, a prescriptive angle that Alan seems unable to help but invoke, which frames calmness not as the sort of sign of success, but as the ingredient for success. The more tranquil a man becomes, he says, the greater is his success, his influence, his power for good. And so if you're reading this in a quest for solutions, how do I become more successful? How do I change my situation? This becomes a roadmap to follow. And I guess if, you map it onto modern self-help kind of formulas, Alan would then have a follow-on course sold as The Art of Serenity. Tranquilize your way to better, to richer, to a life of abundance. And he'd include the testimonial of the ordinary trader who he talks about, who finds prosperity increased through self-control and equanimity. Serenity doesn't just change your relationship with life, it makes you more effective in business and more powerful and influential. And ultimately, that's the reason to pursue it. And so we circle back to the same foundational myth that runs throughout this book. Man is made or unmade by himself. You know, this is that ambiguous seed that can be interpreted in a million different ways, as we've seen and as we continue to see. Self-control is strength. Right thought is mastery. Calmness is power. Say unto your heart, peace, be still. And when I read that in a certain way, I feel those words. They land with a sense of enoughness in this moment. Whether or not they were intended in that way, they release the pressure to strive for right thought and to control the self. They don't declare, calm down in order to be powerful. Speak these quiet words within the heart, peace, be still. It's from here we live. It's within this that meaning comes. It's enough. And through that lens, we might see the needs of the world around us. We choose to respond to what we feel pulling at us. We discover purpose not as some grand mission, but as a quiet question that unfolds within the moment that we find ourselves right now. And I guess my overall conclusion, having read As a Man Thinketh, is we can overly complicate simple things by making systems and theories out of them. And we can make life's beautiful and natural complexities and mysteries oversimplistic when we attempt to control our understanding of them, especially when we do so to categorize and to capitalize on them. So I wonder what you think. Have you read this book? Have you read any James Allen? How did it land for you? Has anything spoken to you as I've kind of gone through what I've read in the way that I have? Have you noticed anything that I've missed? Or missed anything that I've noticed? I would love to hear from you. Feel free to drop me a message. Let me know. And I'll be back again at some point to do it all over again with another book. Until then, take care. Bye-bye.
So shines a good deed in a weary world. Angels in disguise, we can be, 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 we can all be angels in disguise.